Greetings and welcome to this episode of Happenings at 2715. My name is Kurt Gibson, and with me today is IHSA Assistant Executive Director Scott Johnson to talk about his latest book called Association Work, a part biography, part sports history, part organizational chronicle, and occasional literary review that tells the story of C.W. Witten and H.V. Porter, the two most influential men in the interscholastic movement in the first half of the 20th century. In today's episode, Scott and I will talk about the writing of the book, the relationship between these two leaders, and the legacy these two giants left behind. Scott, welcome back to Happenings.
Thank you, Kurt.
Scott, Association Work is your third book built around interscholastic athletics. What draws you to that arena?
Well, I like the antiquities, I like to call them. The eras that you can write about where nobody can really dispute what you've written because nobody really has any idea what you're talking about. But these guys in particular, we have some photographs here in the office hanging on the wall, and if you've been in a place for 25 years, you start to notice them and maybe get some idea to think about what they were like and what they thought, and that's kind of how the whole project started.
And there was some timeliness to the release, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the 100th anniversary of the National Federation of State High School Associations is coming up next summer. So this summer was the 99th anniversary and a kickoff to the centennial year. Both of these fellows were the executive director of the National Federation, as well as working here at the IHSA. And the conference was being held in Chicago, so it all kind of fell together and kind of gave me a reason to have a deadline.
Because that's really what this book is about, the influence and the impact both Mr. Witten and Mr. Porter had on not only the development of the IHSA, but also with the National Federation, and they were doing all of that at the same time.
Right. They were both working on projects for the IHSA and the Federation at the same time. From the time Porter came and became Witten's second command in 1928 until Porter left to be the executive director by himself of the Federation in 1940. For those 12 years, they were operating out of an office in Chicago and doing work on both sides of the aisle, as it were, for the IHSA and the Federation. A lot of work.
Yeah. So this was a pretty ambitious project. So when you're doing something like this, how long did this particular book take from idea to final completion?
It was a little over 4 years. And of course, I didn't work on it exclusively during that time, and there were periods where I just put everything away and maybe didn't even look at it for a month. But the last year and a half, I'd say, it was a pretty solid drive to get it done for this summer. It probably took a lot more work than I thought it was going to be when I started out.
Because these two guys are no longer with us, you probably had to rely more on work they left behind. I'm guessing they had some family, and when you read the book, you can gather there are some living family members still, but a lot of the work had to come from writings and correspondence that they had left behind.
Right. Well, I was very lucky in that regard as a biographer to have as much of their written thoughts and actions as was possible. I mean, we have down in our basement here at the IHSA office still correspondence from the 20s and 30s that Witten wrote to principals, to college authorities. There was just so much material to sift through. And then, of course, the information that was in our magazine, which covered not only IHSA dealings, but also Federation dealings. And then after Porter became the head of the Federation in the 40s, they had a magazine as well. And so I was able to glean a lot of information from there. Old newspapers also were very useful in putting this together. And then there was some family material as well.
Any good stories that you uncovered while you're on the road that maybe didn't make it to the book, or just something unusual that happened along the way?
Well, I don't know if I had a good story, I was going to put it in the book. But there are a lot of good stories in the book, a lot of unusual things, especially having to do with some of their, face-to-face meetings with some of the college folks. There's some famous names in there that kind of take a little bit of a hit. But
Yeah. So the book was distributed at the National Federation's summer meeting this past summer in Chicago, the 99th meeting. How about for the listener out there, if they wanted a copy? Are these now available for purchase? And if so, how?
Yes, they are. And if you go to the IHSA website or to ihsastore.com, you'll see it there listed. We haven't publicized it yet until today outside of the Federation and State Association community, but we'd love for people to get a look at it if you're interested in a biography of the inner workings, I guess, of the State Association, the Federation. Well, this is the place to start, I guess.
Yeah, well, it certainly would be. With the holidays coming, it's the kind of thing that I think the high school sports fan would really enjoy. And even though I'm a bit biased, I got to say your efforts in research and all the time you put in that paid off tremendously. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Kurt.
Our guest on Happenings at 2715 this week is Scott Johnson, author of Association Work. And when we come back, we'll discuss the relationship between CW and HV, as they were called, a relationship that spanned nearly half a century. Welcome back to this extended episode of Happenings at 2715. IHSA Assistant Executive Director Scott Johnson is our guest, and in our first segment, we explored the backstory for Scott's latest book, Association Work, a generally historic piece on the early years of interscholastic athletics in Illinois and the country as a whole. But Scott, now that we've talked a little bit about the backstory, let's spend this segment discussing the two stars of your book, C.W. Witten and H.V. Porter. And so let's begin. Why don't you give us your elevator spiel about each of these men? Tell us a little bit about, where they're from, their past to, becoming workers at the IHSA and then subsequently with the Federation.
Sure. Well, they're both from Central Illinois. Witten was 20 years older than Porter, and they both grew up on farms. They had a very similar background, actually. Neither of them went to high school. Witten could not have gone to high school because there were no high schools in Stark County at that time. And Porter was too far from the nearest high school, which was in Pekin, to go there daily. But they both went to Illinois State University when they were 16 or 17 years old, which was possible at that time, without any high school education, or without a diploma anyway, and became teachers at different high schools. So that part of their backstory is really quite similar. But Witten went on to become professor at ISU, at U of I, and later at Northern Illinois University, and was, I think, pretty happy in that job as a chemistry professor before he took over as principal of DeKalb High School when that principal passed away suddenly at a young age. And so that was kind of his entree into the world of interscholastics, which he knew nothing about and really didn't have much of a sports background either. Porter, on the other hand, became very enchanted with the game of basketball when he was at ISU, and this would have been in the early 1910s. And so as he became principal of high schools in Central Illinois, starting out at Mount Zion, and then Keithsburg over on the Mississippi River, then back to Delavan, and finally Athens, Illinois. In addition to his administrative roles, he was also a music teacher and a basketball coach, and he really loved basketball. And so he came at the problems of interscholastic administration with, I think, a decidedly more enthusiastic response to sports than C.W. Witten could ever muster.
Yeah. Sounds like he was much more the Renaissance man to, Witten's more administrative leaning and organizational type of makeup.
Right. And so it kind of plays out then later on. Witten was very interested in controlling, getting a handle on controlling the athletic scene, because in his mind things had been out of control since the day he took office at DeKalb High School in 1917, I think it was. And so it was all about reining in the excesses that they saw in the interscholastic program. And this was 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. There were excesses in the interscholastic program, if you can imagine that.
Yeah, the more things change, the more they say the same.
Exactly. Whereas Porter, I think, was willing to allow a little bit more of that, and he loved watching the games, and not just basketball, but the other sports as well, especially football and track and field, which were the big ones in the high school at that time. He still believed that there had to be limitations on interscholastic competition to fit within the educational framework, but it was more natural for him to enjoy what we know of high school sports than it ever was for Witten.
So they're about almost a generation apart in age. What brought them together then? Well, how did they finally get connected? One gentleman's up in DeKalb, the other guy's down in Central Illinois. What was sort of that event that brought them together to start this long-time relationship?
They could have met at statewide teachers' meetings, but they probably, if they hadn't met before then, they met at the 1924 state tournament when Athens was in the championship game, and Witten was the executive director or manager at that time of the Illinois High School Association. Would have given out the trophy to him at the end when they won second place. And I think they just kind of hit it off at that point. And he came down to Athens a couple times in the ensuing couple of years to do ceremonial functions. And when Witten was looking for a second in command, I think it was his choice to bring Witten or to bring Porter on board.
Yeah. Do you think there was anything then over the years that really helped the two cement their relationship, or what would you attribute then this relationship that spanned, like I said, nearly half a century? What really brought that together?
Well, they were working side by side in the office for those 12 years that they were in the office together. But outside of that was an area that I think nobody really would have known about unless they probed deeply and asked these fellows, because they were both private individuals. But they had cottages side by side on a private lake in Wisconsin. Witten started there first and invited Porter up to spend some time with him and his wife during a couple of summers in the early 1930s. And eventually Porter bought the lot next to Witten, and they coexisted there in the summers, over the course of 2.5 months during the summer for almost 2 decades.
Yeah. Well, it's clear that they had a very special bond, and you see that throughout, really, since the advent of civilization, how when you've got people working together for a common purpose, how it's easy to develop a lasting relationship, and it's clear these two guys did. So we've talked about the backstory. Now we've talked a little bit about the CW and HV. When we come back from this break, Scott and I will have one more segment together where we'll consider the legacy that both CW Witten and HV Porter have left behind. Welcome back to this extended episode of Happenings at 2715. IHSA Assistant Executive Director Scott Johnson is our guest. And in this episode, we've been discussing Scott's latest book, Association Work, a historic piece on the early years of interscholastic athletics in Illinois and the country. In our first 2 segments, we've discussed the writing of the book and the 2 main protagonists in it, C.W. Witten and H.V. Porter, 2 legendary men whose stories have largely been forgotten by history. Yet, while many people may not recognize the names, the influence both men had on shaping interscholastic athletics in our country continues to this day. And in this final segment, Scott and I will consider the legacy of each man. Scott, in many ways, each of these 2 guys, C.W. Witten and H.V. Porter, had to chart a course for interscholastic athletics that had no roadmap. And in particular, C.W. Witten had to establish standards for 2 organizations in the IHSA and the NFHS. From what you've learned about him, how do you think he was able to provide that kind of leadership for 2 groups at the same time?
I don't know. He must have been a very busy man. And just based on some of the information that I was able to find out, he was gone a lot overnight on trains in the beginning when trains were really the only possible mode of transportation. He must have really been driven by this, which is interesting because, we mentioned that he did not have an athletic background. So it wasn't about his love of sports that drove him to do this. It was about his real belief that the interscholastic program could provide that link to sportsmanship and citizenship that we all hope that it will, and that he could make it better by being a part of it.
Yeah. If from what you've learned then about, and you look back on his life and accomplishments, what would you say C.W. Witten's lasting legacy is?
Well, I think he has a legacy here at the IHSA and at the Federation. There's no question about it. And they're probably co-equal, but I think what he'll be known for most is bringing the Federation together as a single unit. It's kind of funny because my wife and I went up to see the musical Hamilton last week, and it didn't really strike me until she kind of pointed this out as we were walking out the door that Witten and Porter were in that role as founding fathers of these two organizations. They weren't there at the very beginning, either one of them, but they were there in their infancy. And by coincidence, the Federation office was on the same block as the theater where Hamilton is playing right now, and the IHSA office was only 2 blocks away during that time. So it really kind of brought it home as we were walking back to the train to think about what life must have been in Chicago during those times.
Sure. Oh, yeah. That's that's an interesting parallel, and I think for those that have seen Hamilton, they can make that connection. Now, on the other hand, we've got H.V. Porter. I'll call him more of an idealist and an innovator maybe than the hardline administrator Witten was, and I don't say that to imply that Porter was not an effective administrator, but he just did things in a different way. But I think what you learned from reading your book and what we've sort of hit on today was their ability to play off each other's strengths that made them such a strong team. But from what your research has gathered and gleaned, what would you tell our audience, I should say, we should remember most about H.V. Porter?
Well, I think his major role was inserting the high school authorities into the rules-making process. And that happened during the 30s when he was working for the IHSA. This was even before he was employed by the National Federation. But having the ability to sit on those rules committees and write rules that were designed for high school competition, or at least adapted to high school competition, was a huge step forward for the interscholastic movement. Eventually it led to writing our own rules for starting with football, which he was a part of, and then much further down the road, writing rules in basically all the other sports that we now write rules in. In addition, he invented the rules film. He invented the fan-shaped backboard for basketball, and maybe his crowning achievement was the invention of the molded playing balls, starting with basketball, but also applied to footballs and volleyballs and so on. It doesn't get a lot of publicity, as I don't know that there's ever been anything written about it until now, but that was really more of a lasting legacy than his association with the phrase March Madness. Yeah, because until then, the basketball in particular was oftentimes inconsistent from one ball to the next for a variety of reasons. So the molded ball brought greater consistency to the game, even though, as people will read in your book, maybe there was a segment of the population that was just resistant to that kind of change. Yeah, it's interesting that somebody would think that wasn't a good idea to have a consistent ball, but it's true. Yeah. All right, we'll get you out of here on this, and we thank you for your time today, Scott, on this episode of Happenings at 2715. But I'm going to let you go sort of put yourself in both guys' shoes for a second. So give us 20 to 30 seconds from each guy's perspective here.
But if C.W. Witten and H.V. Porter were alive today, what would their take be when they look on the high school interscholastic athletic and activity landscape today?
Well, you can imagine if C.W. Witten was seeing all kinds of problems 100 years ago, he probably wouldn't be too enthusiastic about what he's seeing today. I think Porter would be, would absorb the good things that we still see in interscholastics, and he would, of course, like the athleticism of the players, and I think he'd be happy with where basketball is. Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to project, but I don't know. He would be the one that would be more happy with what he's seeing these days.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to think that they would both appreciate that the work they did and the trail they blazed for everyone that's followed them ended up being a worthwhile journey for both of them.
I think they'd be happy that they contributed.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Scott, again, thanks for taking time to give us this insider's look at your latest book, Association Work. All bias aside, it's extremely well done, and I enjoyed it from cover to cover. And I think you should feel good about the final product because it's really good.
Thank you, Kurt. I appreciate that.
So on behalf of our entire production team, thanks for listening to this extended episode of Happenings at 2715. We look forward to having you join us again real soon. In the meantime, attend a local high school event and support those students in your own community.